Nobody in this room speaks Russian. Adrian Moretti's voice dropped so low the candles almost stopped flickering. 6 of his best men stared at the tablecloth. The Russian across from him smiled slow, satisfied the smile of a man holding a grenade with the pin already pulled. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of violence. Then a voice came from the corner of the room. Quiet, steady, completely unexpected. I do. Every man at the table turned at once. She was holding a coffee pot. She was the waitress. She had been standing 3 feet away from all of them for the past 2 hours. Subscribe right now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story reaches. She had survived 11 years in this room by understanding one rule above all others. The most dangerous thing you can be in a room full of powerful men is memorable. So Natalia Petra was never memorable. She was reliable. She was quiet. She was there when you needed her and gone the moment you didn't. In 11 years at Cello Nero, she had watched judges accept bribes, watched politicians shake hands with men whose names appeared on federal watch lists, watched 3 separate contract negotiations that she was fairly certain he had ended in someone's death. And she had poured wine through all of it with a steady hand and a blank face and not a single word to anyone. That was the job, the real job underneath the job. She had understood that from her very first Thursday night. But tonight, from the second she pushed through the kitchen door at 7:50 p.m. with a tray of water glasses, she knew that something in the air had already broken. Moretti was at the table. He was never at the table when she arrived. Mr. Moretti, she said, neutral, professional, giving nothing. Good evening. He didn't look at her. Both hands were flat on the white tablecloth, and his eyes were fixed on the curtain at the far end of the room, like he was waiting for it to catch fire. Just set it down, he said. She set it down. His underboss, a wide-shouldered man named Carlo, who had the permanent expression of someone smelling something bad, leaned toward Moretti and said under his breath, "They'll be here. Volkov doesn't walk away from this kind of money." Volkov, Moretti said, doesn't do anything that isn't already calculated 3 moves ahead. He finally picked up his espresso cup, looked at it, put it back down without drinking. And neither do I. Natalia moved to the sideboard. She began organizing the bread service with the focused attention of a woman whose entire world was bread. She was listening to every syllable. The Russian delegation arrived at 8:47. She heard the curtain move before she saw them, that particular swipe of heavy fabric, the way it happened when someone pushed through without asking permission. Moretti's men heard it too. 4 of them shifted in their seats. One hand moved toward a jacket lapel and then moved back. 4 men walked in. 3 of them were built like architecture, structural, immovable, placed in the world to support load-bearing weight. The 4th was smaller, older, silver-haired, and moved through the room the way cold air moves through a warm building, quietly, immediately changing the temperature of everything it touched. This was Volkov. Natalia had heard his name 17 times in this room over the past 2 years without ever attaching it to a face. Now she attached it, and the face was worse than anything she had imagined. He had the eyes of a man who had never once been surprised by human behavior, not because he was cynical, but because he had studied people long enough that their actions had become entirely predictable to him. Those eyes moved around the room the way a security camera moves. Methodical, recording. They paused on her for 2 full seconds. She was arranging bread rolls with the concentration of a surgeon. "Mr. Moretti." Volkov's English was perfect, the accent precisely calibrated, present enough to remind you where he was from, controlled enough to remind you he chose what he revealed. "Apologies for the delay. The city." "Sit down, Volkov," Moretti said, not a greeting, a command very slightly disguised. Volkov sat. His 3 men positioned themselves with the wordless coordination of people who had operated as one organism for a very long time. The broad one, the one with a scar along his jaw that hadn't healed straight, pulled his chair just slightly back from the table. Hands free, eyes on the room. Natalia noticed. She always noticed. The first 20 minutes were careful, both men speaking in the clipped surface-level language of negotiation, dates, figures, logistics, the vocabulary of business that was designed to sound ordinary, even when it wasn't. Natalia moved through it, refilling glasses, replacing silverware, performing her invisibility with the ease of long practice. Then Volkov turned to the scar-faced man beside him and spoke in Russian. It was brief. 2 sentences. Conversational. Natalia was at the far end of the table. Her back was 3/4 turned. Her hand was on the water pitcher. She heard every word. The confirmation did it come through? Not yet. But it doesn't need to. By the end of tonight, we'll have everything else. Her hand did not shake. She finished pouring the water. She set the pitcher down. She went to the sideboard. Breathe, process, stay in your lane. Moretti had heard the Russian too. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, that particular tension that meant something had entered the room that he couldn't read, and he knew it, and he hated it. We conduct our business in English, he said, his voice carrying the absolute calm of a man who has enough violence behind him that he never needs to raise it. That was the agreement. Volkov looked at him. Of course. My apologies. The smile, patient, slightly condescending, force of habit, but he did it again 7 minutes later. A murmur to the man on his left, just 4 words, just enough to remind everyone in the room that there was a private conversation happening inside the public one, and that Moretti's side of the table had no access to it. Moretti's jaw tightened. Carlo looked at the ceiling. Not one of the 6 men around Moretti understood Russian. Natalia understood all of it. She stood at the sideboard and she listened, and the pieces assembled themselves in her mind with the cold mechanical precision of a machine that had been running for a very long time, waiting for exactly this kind of input. The shipment wasn't just weapons. It was a category of weapon untraceable, already purchased, the payment routed through a front company that Moretti himself had established 18 months ago. She'd heard discussions about that front company in this room. She'd heard the name of it. She knew who had signed the paperwork. But Volkov's people had documentation of every transaction, every payment confirmation, every communication that had moved between Moretti's operation and the suppliers. They had been collecting it carefully and methodically for longer than Moretti knew. They weren't here to sell. They were here to own him. She heard the Russian word the 3rd time Volkov spoke to his man, and the word hit her like a fist to the sternum. Chantage. Blackmail. She picked up a clean fork, put it on her tray, walked back toward the table. Her father had died because of men who used that word, men who collected information the way other people collected money, as currency, as power, as the thing that kept you alive after the trade was finished. Dmitry Petrov had been used exactly this way, had been squeezed until there was nothing left to take. And then he'd had his car accident. She was not her father. She set the fork in its place and stepped back from the table and breathed. Damn. At 11:10, the main course arrived, and with it, the moment that changed everything. Volkov was speaking. Moretti was listening. Carlo had his forearms on the table and the look of a man trying very hard to hear something in a language he didn't have. The 3 Russians were eating. The scar-faced man was watching the room. And Volkov, without any transition at all, switched to Russian mid-sentence and said to his associate across the table, in a voice clearly meant to be private, "She's been in the corner for 20 minutes. She's too still. Still people are always listening." The scar-faced man glanced at Natalia. Natalia was examining the dessert menu layout with the focused concern of a woman who had strong opinions about font sizes. The scar-faced man answered, "Should we move the conversation?" Volkov said no. "If she understands us, we need to know now before the next part." "Watch her face." And then deliberate and unhurried, Volkov looked directly at Natalia and said in Russian in a perfectly pleasant tone, "Excuse me, could you bring more bread, please?" The table went very quiet. Moretti was watching her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were doing something complex. Natalia looked up from the menu. She looked at Volkov with the polite, mildly questioning expression of a woman who had heard a sound but wasn't sure what kind of sound it was. "Sir," she said, in English. Volkov said it again, Russian, slower. "I'm sorry," she said with a small apologetic smile. "I didn't quite catch that." Volkov studied her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned back to Moretti and said in English, "More bread, please." And his tone said very clearly that he wasn't entirely sure about what he'd just seen and that he intended to find out. 2 minutes later, she was at Moretti's end of the table. She refilled his glass. She leaned in just slightly, just enough to be heard and not seen, and she said barely above a breath, "He was testing me." Moretti's hand pressed flat on the tablecloth. "And he's not sure yet." She straightened, met his eyes directly for the first time in 11 years. "But he will be. The man with the scar has been watching me for the last 15 minutes. Moretti looked at her, really looked at her. The way people look at something they've been walking past for years and suddenly realize they didn't understand. How much, he said very quietly, have you understood tonight? She held his gaze. Everything, Mr. Moretti. The silence that followed lasted 5 seconds. She counted each one. Everything, he repeated. Not a question. Processing. Recalibrating. The expression that crossed his face was unlike anything she'd seen from him in 11 years. It wasn't fear exactly, and it wasn't relief. It was the expression of a man who has just realized the game he thought he was playing has different rules than he knew. And that changes either everything or nothing, and he hasn't yet decided which. Stay close, he said. I always do, she said. She was back at the sideboard when the scar-faced man stood up. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't look at Volkov. He just stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the far end of the room, toward the sideboard, toward where she was standing. Her pulse hit the roof of her mouth. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell the cold that was still in his coat. This is excellent, he said in English accented, careful. He picked up one of the bread rolls she'd been arranging and looked at it. Very fresh. Thank you, she said. They bake them here. He set it down. He looked at the sideboard. He was very close. Long night for you, he said. They all are, she said. Thursdays especially. He looked at her then, direct, patient, the look of someone conducting a very methodical search. You've been here long, he said, at this restaurant. 11 years. That's very long, he said. You must know these people well. The regulars. I know their orders, she said. That's usually enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then in Russian he said very softly, almost under his breath, testing, precisely testing. What is enough and what is too much? It wasn't a question. It was a tripwire. She looked him directly in the eye. Pardon, he smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Nothing, just thinking out loud. He picked up his water glass. Thank you for the bread. He walked back to the table. She didn't move for 4 full seconds. Then she picked up her tray, turned her back on the room, and gripped the edge of the sideboard with both hands where no one could see. Her father had been tested exactly like that. The same way, the same kind of casual throwaway sentence in Russian that was actually a carefully sharpened instrument to see if you flinched. Her father had flinched. She had not. But the scar-faced man was going to go back to Volkov and say, I'm not sure. And Volkov was going to look at her one more time, and then Volkov was going to make a decision. And whatever decision he made next, Moretti needed to know about it before it happened. She picked up her tray. She turned around. She walked back into the room. And Volkov looked up as she entered, and this time there was no smile. He said something to the scar-faced man in Russian. Fast. 2 words. She knows. The scar-faced man looked at his hands. Volkov looked at Moretti. Perhaps, he said in English pleasantly, we should ask the staff to give us some privacy for the next part of the discussion. Moretti looked at Natalia. Natalia looked at Moretti. And in the fraction of a second that they held each other's eyes, she watched him make a decision. One that she understood completely. One that terrified her, and also in some part of herself, she didn't fully have access to. One that felt like the moment she'd been standing 3 feet from this table waiting for 11 years. She stays, Moretti said. Volkov's expression didn't change. I'm not sure that's she stays, Moretti said again. And now the voice was different, not louder, but denser, the way iron is different from aluminum, even at the same size. And you're going to tell me right now in English exactly what your man said to her at the sideboard. The room went absolutely still. Volkov looked at Moretti, then he looked at Natalia. I think, he said slowly, that your waitress has been keeping secrets from you. Tell me something I don't know, Moretti said. Volkov smiled. This time the smile was entirely real. I intend to, he said. That's rather the whole point of tonight. And from his jacket pocket, he placed a single photograph on the white tablecloth. Natalia saw it from where she stood. She recognized the location. She recognized the date stamp in the corner. And she recognized the face because the face in the photograph was hers. The photograph was face up on the white tablecloth and nobody in the room was breathing. Natalia stood exactly where she was. She did not move toward it. She did not move away. She held the tray against her side and she looked at the photograph with the carefully managed expression of a woman who was seeing something she didn't recognize, and every cell in her body was screaming at her to keep that expression locked because the second it cracked, everything ended. The photograph was taken outside this building. She could tell from the angle from the specific slant of the light hitting the sidewalk. It was taken at night sometime in the past few months, and it showed her unmistakably her standing beside a black car that did not belong to her, speaking to a man whose face was partially turned away from the camera. She knew the man's face. She knew it very well. What she did not know was who had been standing across the street with a camera. Moretti looked at the photograph, then he looked at her. His face gave away absolutely nothing, but his right hand, still flat on the tablecloth, had pressed down hard enough that his knuckles had gone slightly pale. "Who is that?" he said. To her, not to Volkov. She looked at the photograph for 2 more seconds, long enough to be believable, short enough to be careful. "I don't know what that is," she said. "Look closer," Volkov said pleasantly. "I'm looking," she said. "I don't know what I'm looking at." "That's you," Volkov said, "outside this building. 11 weeks ago on a Thursday." He tapped the edge of the photograph with one finger, almost gently, the way you tap a bubble to see if it's real. "And the gentleman you're speaking with is a federal employee." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Federal. Carlo stood up so fast his chair scraped back. "What did you just say?" Moretti raised one hand. Carlo stopped, sat back down. The speed of his obedience was its own kind of violence. Moretti looked at Natalia, only at her. "Explain it," he said, and this was the moment. This was the exact razor-thin edge between 2 completely different outcomes, and she had approximately 4 seconds to decide which side of it she was going to land on, because Volkov was watching her face with the focused attention of someone who had done this exact thing dozens of times and knew precisely what a lie looked like in the first half second before the person telling it had fully committed to it. "That's my cousin," she said. "Mikhail. He works for the city, Department of Transportation. He drops me home sometimes when my shift runs late." Silence. Volkov looked at her. She looked back at him. Her expression was exactly what it needed to be. Mild irritation, the look of someone who has just been accused of something embarrassing and slightly insulting, rather than something dangerous. "Your cousin," Volkov said. "My cousin, Mikhail. He's been in this country for 6 years. He lives in Queens." She put the tray in on the sideboard with a small click. "I'm happy to give you his phone number if you'd like to verify that." Another silence. Longer this time. Then Volkov did something she hadn't expected. He laughed, not loudly, just a short exhale of genuine amusement. He picked up the photograph and slid it back into his jacket pocket. "No," he said, "that won't be necessary." And from the way he said it, easy, unhurried, completely unbothered, she knew with absolute certainty that he did not believe a single word she just said. He just hadn't decided yet what to do about it. Moretti had made no such calculation. He looked at her for 3 more seconds, and then he looked at Volkov, and when he spoke, his voice was the temperature of something that had been cold for a very long time. "You brought surveillance photographs of my staff to my table," he said, "in my restaurant." "I brought information," Volkov said, "because information is the only currency that matters tonight. You know this." "What I know," Moretti said, "is that you came here to discuss a transaction, not to make accusations about people in my employ." "I came here," Volkov said, leaning forward just slightly, "because someone in your operation has been leaking information to federal authorities for a minimum of 4 months. Transaction records, meeting schedules, names." He paused. "Your name specifically attached to a shipment that I believe you'd very much prefer remained unattached from you." The air in the room changed. Natalia felt it, the specific shift that happens when a conversation stops being a negotiation and becomes something else entirely. Carlo looked at Moretti. Moretti didn't look at Carlo. 4 months, Moretti said. "At least," Volkov said. "And you're sitting here telling me this is my waitress." "I'm sitting here telling you that someone has been speaking to people they shouldn't be speaking to, and that the woman in this photograph was photographed speaking to one of them." Volkov spread his hands in a gesture of perfectly calibrated reasonableness. "I leave the conclusions to you." Moretti stood up. It was not a dramatic movement. He just stood, straightened his jacket, and the room reorganized itself around that simple action, the way a room reorganizes around a change in air pressure. 2 of his men pushed back from the table slightly. Carlo got to his feet. The three Russians went very still. Moretti walked to the sideboard. He stopped beside Natalia. He was 6 inches taller than her, and he stood close enough that she could hear him breathe, and for a moment he said nothing at all. 11 years, he said, very quiet. Yes, she said. And in 11 years, has anyone in this room ever given you a reason to go looking for help somewhere else? It was the most honest question he had ever asked her. She understood that immediately understood that for Moretti this was the thing that actually mattered. Not whether she'd spoken to someone, not even what she'd said, but whether something in this room had made her feel that she needed to. No, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then he turned back to the table. The woman stays, he said. And you, he looked at Volkov, are going to tell me exactly how long you've had surveillance on this building, because that is a conversation we are absolutely going to have tonight. Volkov sat back in his chair. He seemed, if anything, satisfied. 18 months, he said, since the day we began discussing this transaction. Standard precaution. You had my restaurant under surveillance for 18 months. We had the surrounding area under observation. Your restaurant happened to be at the center of it. A small pause. As it tends to be, Carlo said under his breath and not quite quietly enough. I'm going to Carlo. Moretti's voice, not loud. Carlo sat down. Natalia picked up her tray. She moved back around the table, refilling glasses, her pace perfectly, even her face perfectly blank. Inside her chest, her heart was hitting so hard she was genuinely concerned it was audible. Mikhail was not her cousin. Mikhail was Special Agent Daniel Reeves of the FBI's Organized Crime Division, and she had been passing him information carefully, selectively, piece by piece, wrapped in the kind of plausible deniability that she had learned from 11 years of watching how powerful men protected themselves for almost 6 months. Not because she'd been recruited, not because anyone had approached her, because 3 years ago she had finally identified the man who had arranged her father's death. And that man's name was in Moretti's address book. And the only way to get to him was through the organization that protected him, which meant she needed the FBI, which meant she needed leverage, which meant she needed everything she'd heard in this room for 11 years to become useful in a very specific way. She had not expected to be photographed. She had not expected Volkov to have surveillance on the building. And she had absolutely not expected to be standing in this room right now with the photograph already on the table, trying to hold together a cover story that had just been hit from 3 different directions simultaneously. She refilled Volkov's glass last. She stood beside him for just a second longer than necessary. He looked up at her, those camera eyes, recording. Thank you, he said, in Russian. She smiled at him, warm, professional, entirely empty. Of course, she said, in English. He watched her walk back to the sideboard. Then he turned to Moretti and said, I'd like to propose something in a gesture of good faith from both sides. Moretti sat back down. I'm listening. The transaction we've been discussing, the shipment, the documentation, the transfer of funds, all of it can proceed exactly as planned. Tonight, in fact, if you prefer. He folded his hands on the table. With one addition. What addition? Volkov looked at Natalia. Her, he said. I want her in the room when the final terms are confirmed, as translator. Full transparency, everything spoken in any language rendered into English for both parties. He paused. No more private conversations. No more questions about what was said and what wasn't. Clean and clear from this point forward. Moretti stared at him. You want my waitress to serve as your translator. I want a neutral party, Volkov said. Someone neither of us fully trust yet, which in my experience makes for the most honest translation. The table was very quiet. Natalia stood at the sideboard and understood with the clarity of ice water exactly what Volkov was doing. He didn't want a translator. He wanted to put her in the center of the room, visible, identified, her role acknowledged, so that if she was feeding information to the FBI, anything she heard from this point forward would be information she couldn't hand over without revealing that she'd been present for a criminal transaction. He was going to make her complicit, deliberately, in front of witnesses. It was elegant, it was vicious, and it was almost certainly going to work, unless she moved first. Moretti looked at her. Natalia. It was the first time in 11 years he had used her name in this room. Not Miss Not You, not the way he usually indicated her presence with a glance or a gesture. Her name. Mr. Moretti, she said, do you want to do this? And there it was. The choice she had been building toward for 6 months handed to her right now in the worst possible circumstances, with Volkov watching her face and the Scarface man watching her hands, and 4 of Moretti's people watching everything. She crossed the room. She pulled out the empty chair at the corner of the table, the chair that put her between both delegations, equidistant, exactly where Volkov had intended her to be. She sat down. She put her tray on the floor beside her chair. I'll need to understand exactly what topics are being discussed, she said, so I can be accurate. Of course, Volkov said. And I should tell you, she said, looking directly at Volkov now, that I will translate everything I hear, completely and accurately, for both sides. She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. Everything. Something flickered in Volkov's eyes. Fast, gone immediately, but she caught it and she filed it and she understood what it meant. He hadn't expected that. The emphasis on everything, the implication that she might translate things he said in Russian that he hadn't intended for Moretti to hear, that was not part of his calculation. Good. He hadn't needed to calculate for her because until 40 minutes ago he hadn't known she existed. That was the only advantage she had left, and she was going to use it with both hands. Volkov smiled. Perfect, he said. Then let's begin. He reached into his jacket again. But this time it wasn't a photograph that he placed on the table. It was a document. 12 pages clipped together, dense with text in 2 columns, English on the left, Russian on the right. This, Volkov said, is the documentation we've been discussing, the complete record of every transaction conducted over the past 18 months through the shell company registered in Delaware under the name Coastal Meridian Holdings. He looked at Moretti. Your company, Mr. Moretti, or your money, your signature, your funds. Moretti looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. And the second column, he said. Volkov looked at Natalia, inviting her. Perhaps our translator would like to read it. She pulled the document toward her. She read the first page, then the second. Her face stayed even, but her mind was sprinting because what she was reading was not just documentation of Moretti's transactions. It was documentation of Volkov's. Every transfer, every communication, both sides of every exchange recorded with a completeness that could only come from one of 2 sources. Either someone inside Volkov's organization had been as meticulous as she had been, or someone had been recording both of them from the outside. The FBI. She looked up from the document. Volkov was watching her face. She said carefully, the second column is a mirror record. Everything in the English column is duplicated and verified in Russian, with timestamps and account references. She slid the document toward the center of the table. It's a complete transaction record for both parties. Moretti said nothing for a moment. Then, both parties. Both parties, Natalia confirmed. Moretti looked at Volkov. You're telling me you have documentation that implicates yourself as much as it implicates me. I'm telling you, Volkov said, that I have documentation that neither of us can allow to reach anyone outside this room. He leaned forward. Which means we have the same problem. Which means we have the same solution. He put his hand flat on the document, and the solution is in the final 4 pages, which I'd like your translator to read aloud. She turned to the final 4 pages. She read the first paragraph, and she understood with complete and devastating clarity why Volkov had wanted her in this room. Because the final 4 pages weren't a business proposal. They were a set of instructions for the removal of specific individuals who had been identified as information sources, federal contacts, informants. The list was 8 names long. Her eyes moved down the page. The last name on the list was hers. She closed the document. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked across at Volkov, and for the first time since he had walked through that curtain, she did not manage her expression. She let him see exactly what was in her face, not fear, because she had burned through the fear in the last 30 seconds and come out the other side of it into something colder and clearer and considerably more dangerous. Volkov looked back at her. Read it, he said, quietly, still pleasant, still patient. No, she said. The table went completely still. Moretti looked at her. Natalia. The final section, she said, not looking away from Volkov, is not a transaction agreement. She kept her voice even factual, the voice she had used for 11 years to convey information in a room full of people who could hurt her. It's an elimination list. 8 people identified as federal informants. She paused. I'm the last name on it. Nobody moved. Then Carlos said very slowly, "What did you just say?" "My name," she said, "is on a list in a document that this man brought to this table tonight, along with 7 other people." She finally looked away from Volkov and looked at Moretti. "Which means he didn't come here to make a deal. He came here to get you to authorize it." Moretti looked at Volkov. Volkov said nothing. "Is that true?" Moretti said. His voice was completely flat now. All the weight and texture had gone out of it. What remained was something that had no patience left in it at all. Volkov looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the scar-faced man. Something passed between them, a calculation, an adjustment, a door closing. Then Volkov looked back at Moretti and said, "The woman on this list has been passing information to the FBI for 6 months. She has compromised 3 of your operations. She has put your name on federal documents that already exist and cannot be uncreated." He spread his hands. "I came here to give you the opportunity to resolve that, before it resolves itself in a way that is considerably worse for you." Moretti looked at Natalia. Natalia looked at Moretti. She had one move left, one thing she had held back through everything the photograph. The document, the list waiting for the moment when it would matter most, when it would be the only thing standing between her and whatever the scar-faced man was certainly thinking about right now. She reached into her apron pocket. She put her phone on the table. She pressed play. Volkov's voice came out of the speaker, clear and steady from the recording she had started the moment she sat down in the chair. His voice said in Russian to the scar-faced man approximately 9 minutes earlier, "Once Moretti signs the final pages, he owns all of it. The list, the authorization, his signature on a document ordering the death of a federal informant. We won't need the blackmail file after that. We'll own him completely." The recording ended. Silence. Volkov looked at the phone on the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Natalia, and for the first time since he had walked into this room, he looked at her without the smile. "You've been recording this entire conversation," he said. "I translate everything," she said. "I told you that." Carlo was on his feet. Moretti's hand was up again. "Stop, wait, hold." But his eyes were on Volkov, and what was in his eyes was something that had moved entirely past anger into a territory that didn't have a clean name. Volkov straightened his jacket. He was still calm. It was the most frightening thing in the room, that specific, continuing calm. "You understand," he said to no one in particular, "that this changes the nature of tonight considerably?" "Yes," Moretti said. "It does." "Then I suggest—" "You're not suggesting anything else tonight," Moretti said. "You came into my house. You brought photographs of my people. You put a list on my table with my waitress's name on it and asked me to sign it." He stood again, slowly. The same movement as before, no drama, just weight, shifting the room, reorganizing. "And my waitress has been recording you for the last 15 minutes. Volkov looked at her one last time. She picked up her phone. She held it in both hands. She looked back at him steadily. "I want to be very clear about something," she said. "The recording exists. Copies of it exist." She paused. "I've been in this room for 11 years. I know how to make sure things survive me." Volkov was silent for 3 full seconds. Then very quietly he said, "Who are you?" And she looked at him, and she thought of her father in his car on a Tuesday morning, and she thought of a Russian word spoken outside her building 17 years ago, and she thought of every Thursday night in this room, invisible, weightless, utterly present. "I'm the waitress," she said. And outside, somewhere on the street below them, a phone was already ringing. The phone was still in her hand when the curtain moved. Not from the kitchen side. From the main dining room, the side that was supposed to be locked, the side where Gerald had been told every Thursday for 11 years that under no circumstances was he to allow anyone through until the back room had cleared. The velvet moved, and 2 people stepped through it, and neither of them was Gerald. The first was a woman Natalia had never seen. Mid-40s, short, dark hair, a coat that was slightly too casual for the restaurant and slightly too structured for someone who had just wandered in off the street. Her eyes went around the room in exactly the same way Volkov's had, systematic recording, but faster, more practiced. The second was Special Agent Daniel Reeves, Mikhail, her cousin. He looked at her across the room, and what moved across his face was something she had never seen from him in 6 months of carefully managed meetings in parking garages and coffee shops, and once, memorably on a bench in Central Park at 6 in the morning. It was relief, actual unguarded human relief. As though he had been holding his breath for the past 3 hours and had only now been given permission to exhale. "Nobody move," the woman said. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Carlo moved anyway. He got approximately halfway to his feet before two more agents came through the kitchen door, and then he sat back down with the expression of a man who has just remembered a very important appointment. Volkov did not move at all. He sat in his chair, both hands visible on the table, and watched the room reorganize itself around this new development with the infuriating calm of a man who had already adjusted his calculations and found that the new numbers were acceptable. That terrified her more than anything that had happened so far. Reeves crossed to her. He stopped close enough to speak quietly. "Are you all right? I'm sitting at a table with 12 armed men and a document with my name on a kill list," she said. "Define you all right." "The recording," he said. "We got it. The moment you hit play, it transmitted." He glanced at the phone in her hand. "That was the signal." She looked at him. "I didn't know that was the signal." "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." She stared at him for one long second. Then she put the phone face down on the table very carefully and breathed. The woman with the dark hair had positioned herself at the head of the table between Moretti and Volkov, with the easy authority of someone who had stood in exactly this position many times before, and understood that the key to controlling a room full of dangerous men was to act as though the outcome had already been decided. "I'm Special Agent Patricia Harmon, FBI Organized Crime Division," she said. "Mr. Moretti, Mr. Volkov, I need everyone to stay seated and keep their hands where I can see them." Moretti looked at her. Then he looked at Natalia. His expression had passed through shock and anger and had arrived somewhere much quieter and considerably more complex. "How long?" he said. Not to Harmon, to Natalia. 6 months, she said. 6 months. He said it the way you say something when you're testing whether it sounds as bad out loud as it does in your head. It did. "And before that, I was your waitress," she said. "Just your waitress." What changed? She had thought about this moment. She had imagined it in different configurations in a courtroom, in an interrogation room, in the abstract safe space of a future she was working toward, but couldn't fully picture. She had not imagined it like this at his table with his hands flat in front of him, and federal agents at every door, and Volkov 12 feet away, listening to every word. "Viktor Lysenko," she said. The name hit Moretti like a physical thing. She watched it land, watched his face do something she had never seen it do in 11 years, which was lose its composure for a full 3 seconds. Not anger, something older than anger, something that had history in it. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. "He killed my father," she said. 17 years ago, and he works for you." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences in the room tonight. This one had weight. This one was personal. Carlo looked at Moretti. Moretti did not look at Carlo. From the other end of the table, Volkov said quietly, almost to himself, "Lysenko." And then in Russian to no one in particular, just thinking aloud the way people do when they've just received a piece of information that rearranges other pieces they already had, he said, "So that's what this was actually about." Reeves looked at Natalia. She looked back at him. Neither of them confirmed it. They didn't need to. Harmon set a folder on the table. She opened it to the first page and turned it so Moretti could read it. "Mr. Moretti, what I'm showing you is a federal grand jury indictment that was filed under seal this morning. 37 counts, including racketeering, weapons trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice." She turned a page. "Your name appears on every count." Moretti looked at the document. He did not pick it up. "And Lysenko's name," he said. "Count 14 through count 22, she said. "Specifically." She paused. "He's been in federal custody since 6:30 this evening." Something moved through the room at that, a collective, almost physical release of pressure like a building settling. Two of Moretti's men exchanged a glance. The scar-faced man at Volkov's side shifted in his chair. Moretti looked up from the indictment. He looked at Natalia, and what was in his face now was something she had not expected and couldn't fully name. It wasn't betrayal exactly, and it wasn't forgiveness, and it was nowhere near simple. It was the expression of a man who has just had an extremely complicated equation explained to him and found that the answer was not what he expected, but that he understood the math. You weren't working against me, he said, slowly, working it out as he spoke. You were working toward him, and I was in the way. You weren't in the way, she said. You were the only path. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and if Lysenko hadn't been in my organization, then I would have spent 11 years being your waitress, she said, and you'd never have known I understood a word of Russian. Another silence. This one almost had something human in it. Then Volkov cleared his throat. This is very touching, he said, but I'd like to direct the room's attention to the fact that the indictment Agent Harmon has placed on the table contains 37 counts related to Mr. Moretti's organization. He folded his hands. I don't see my name on any of them. Harmon looked at him. No, she said, you don't. Which suggests, Volkov said, that the federal government's interest tonight is primarily in Mr. Moretti's operation and not in mine. It suggests, Harmon said, that we're having a conversation about the scope of tonight's cooperation. Volkov smiled. There it was again, that smile back in its place. The equilibrium restored the man back in his calculations and comfortable there. Then let's have that conversation, he said. I've been very patient. Natalia looked at Reeves. He planned for this, she said quietly. He knew there was a federal investigation. He came tonight to use Moretti's indictment as leverage. If Moretti goes down, the weapons transaction disappears with him and Volkov walks away clean. Reeves looked at Harmon. Harmon was already looking at Volkov. The document you brought tonight, she said, the 12 pages. A business record, Volkov said smoothly. Entirely internal, nothing actionable. The final 4 pages contain an authorization for the elimination of 8 individuals, she said, including a federal informant. That's solicitation to murder a federal witness. That's not a business record. Volkov's expression did not change. I brought that document as evidence of Mr. Moretti's activities. I had no intention of... We have the recording, Reeves said. For the first time, the composure slipped. Not much a hairline fracture barely visible. But Natalia saw it because she had been watching his face all night, and she knew exactly what his equilibrium looked like, and this was not it. The recording, Volkov said, of a private conversation. Recorded by an individual present in the room, Harmon said. Admissible in every federal court in this country. She closed her folder. Mr. Volkov, I'd like you to come with us. The scar-faced man pushed back from the table. 3 things happened at the same time Reeves stepped between the scar-faced man and Natalia. 2 agents behind Volkov moved forward, and Carlo, operating on pure instinct in 11 years of loyalty, shoved the table hard enough to knock 3 water glasses over the edge. The crash of the glasses was shockingly loud in the contained space. Water spread across the tablecloth. Someone swore. 2 agents had their hands on their weapons. Stop, Moretti's voice. Single word, no particular volume, absolute authority. Everything stopped. The scar-faced man froze where he was. Carlos sat down for the second time tonight. The water ran off the edge of the table and dripped onto the floor with a sound that seemed enormous in the stillness. Moretti looked at Volkov. It's done, he said. Don't make it worse. Volkov looked back at him. Something passed between them. The complex, wordless communication of 2 men who have operated in the same world long enough to understand each other's logic even when they're on opposite sides of it. You're remarkably calm, Volkov said. I've been prepared for this room for 12 years, Moretti said. I just didn't know which Thursday it was going to be. Harmon nodded to the 2 agents behind Volkov. They moved. Volkov stood slowly with the careful dignity of a man who intends to control whatever he still has control over, and straightened his jacket for the second time that night. He looked at Natalia as he stood. 6 months, he said. You did all of this in 6 months from a position with no institutional support, no legal protection, and no guarantee of survival. He looked at her with something that she realized with a cold shock genuine. Your father would have been impressed. She looked at him. Don't talk about my father. No, he said. I suppose not. He buttoned his jacket. For what it's worth, and I understand it's worth very little, Viktor Lysenko made his own choices. Your father was a casualty of his ambition, not mine. I know, she said. That's why your name isn't on the indictment. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he walked toward the door with the two agents, and he did not look back. The room exhaled. Reeves touched her arm. We need to get you out of here. In a minute, she said. She turned to Moretti. He was still at the head of the table, both hands in front of him, the indictment open on the wet tablecloth. His men were around him, some standing, some seated, all of them with the stunned, directionless energy of people whose structure has just collapsed and who haven't yet decided what to do about it. Carlo looked at her with something she couldn't fully read. Not rage, exactly. More like the grief of a man who has realized that the enemy was never who he thought it was, and that it's too late now to do anything useful with that information. She looked at Moretti. Lysenko, he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table. He told me your father came to him, that your father owed money to people he couldn't pay, and that the accident was that it wasn't. He stopped. He looked up. I believed him. I know, she said. I should have. You couldn't have known, she said. He was very good at being believed. Moretti was quiet for a long time. Harmon was speaking to two other agents near the kitchen door. Reeves was close to Natalia, giving her the space she'd asked for, but not moving away. The room was busy with the specific activity of a situation being processed and managed, agents moving, positions being established, the machinery of consequence beginning to turn. In the middle of it, Moretti said, "Will you testify?" She looked at him. To what? To what you heard, in this room, over 11 years. He met her eyes. All of it. That depends on what the agreement looks like, she said. That's not my decision alone. He nodded slowly. Lysenko's people, the ones still outside. There are 3 of them. He slid a folded piece of paper across the wet tablecloth. Names, positions, current locations as of tonight. He looked at Harmon's direction. Give that to whoever needs it. She picked up the paper. Mr. Moretti, Reeves said, stepping forward. I need to ask you to. I know, Moretti said. He looked at Natalia one last time. You were the best person in this room, he said. In 11 years, you were the best person in this room. I just never thought to look. She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure one existed. Reeves guided her toward the kitchen door. She picked up her tray from the floor beside the chair where she'd sat at the table. The chair she'd pulled out herself, the position she'd chosen herself, the decision that had started everything that came after. She held the tray against her side out of pure habit. Harmon fell into step beside her as they moved through the kitchen. The recording is Kane, she said. Volkov's statement regarding the list, his intent to use Moretti's signature against him, the solicitation, all of it is on their admissible clean chain of custody. She paused. You did good work tonight. I've been doing good work for 6 months, Natalia said. Tonight I nearly got killed 3 separate times. That's usually how the good work goes, Harmon said, without any particular apology in it, but also without dismissal. Just honesty, the specific honesty of someone who understood the cost of the work and wasn't going to pretend it was smaller than it was. Natalia stopped at the kitchen door. Through the pass-through, she could see the main dining room. The ordinary Thursday night crowd still eating, still talking, not one of them aware that the back room had spent the last 3 hours containing enough consequence to reshape the Eastern Seaboard's criminal infrastructure. Gerald was at the host stand, sweating through his collar as usual, phone to his ear, the expression of a man who has been told something alarming by someone official and is still trying to process whether it's real. He looked up and saw her standing in the kitchen doorway. She gave him a small nod. He stared at her for a long moment, his mouth slightly open. She didn't owe him an explanation. She didn't owe anyone in this room an explanation. She had been invisible for 11 years and now she wasn't, and what that meant for everyone else was going to take a long time to sort itself out. What it meant for her, she wasn't ready to look at that yet. Reeves came through the door behind her. Cars outside, we'll take you somewhere safe tonight, get a full debrief started in the morning. Lysenko, she said, I need to know he's actually in custody. Not your word, not Harmon's word. I need confirmation. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He pulled up a message, turned the screen toward her. A photograph. Viktor Lysenko in the specific unflattering lighting of a federal holding facility facing a booking camera. The timestamp read 6:34 p.m. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She had been carrying the face of this man in her head for 17 years. She had seen it in dreams in the reflection of restaurant windows, in the faces of the men who passed through the back room at Cello Nero, and occasionally resembled him around the eyes or the jaw. She had built the last 6 months of her life around the fact of his existence, and the specific consuming need to transform that fact into something that had legal weight and institutional consequence, and the power to mean that her father's death had not been the end of the story. The man in the photograph looked ordinary. That was the thing that always got her in the abstract, how ordinary, dangerous men looked when the context was stripped away. Just a man, just a face, not a monster, not a shadow, just a person who had made choices and was now beginning to experience their trajectory. She handed the phone back to Reeves. "Okay," she said. They moved toward the back exit, the one that Moretti had always kept locked on Thursday nights, the one Gerald personally checked before service. Tonight it was propped open with a brick, and outside there were cars and agents and the ordinary 4 a.m. noise of a city that had continued without awareness of everything that had just changed inside this building. She stepped through the door. The cold hit her immediately sharp, actual, the kind of cold that cuts through everything you've built up inside yourself and reminds you that you have a body and the body is currently in the world, and the world is happening right now in real time without waiting for you to be ready. She stopped on the sidewalk. She held her tray. She breathed. Reeves stood beside her. He didn't say anything. She had come to understand, over 6 months of working with him, an unusually well-developed instinct for when words were the wrong tool. A minute passed, then she said the poems. He looked at her. What? The final section of the document Volkov brought, the last 4 pages before the list. She turned to look at him. The authorization language was embedded in what looked like a standard contract appendix. But before that, there were 11 entries, cross-reference codes, each one attached to a name in Moretti's operation. I read them while I was sitting at the table. Reeves was very still. "What kind of entries?" "Scheduled transactions," she said. "Not related to tonight's deal, separate, already confirmed, already in motion." She looked at him directly. 6 of the names on that list are in federal witness protection. The color left Reeves's face so fast it was almost remarkable. "Volkov has a source," she said. "Inside the program, someone who has been feeding him protected witness identities." That's what the codes were. She reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded napkin, white cloth, Cello Nero's specific heavy linen, the kind they laundered on site. She had written on it in pencil from the small stub she kept in her uniform pocket for taking orders. "I wrote down what I could before Harmon came through the curtain." He took the napkin, he looked at what was written on it. Then he looked at her. "When did you, while Volkov was talking to Harmon," she said, "after he stood up. Everyone was watching him. Nobody was watching me." She picked up her tray again, tucking it back against her side. 11 years of practice. He stared at her for another second. Then he pulled out his radio. She turned and looked back at the restaurant. Through the kitchen window, she could see the pass through the edge of the main dining room. The ordinary light of an ordinary establishment, at the end of a long night, tables being cleared, candles being extinguished, the careful, unhurried work of closing a place down. The backroom curtain was visible from here, just at the edge of the light, velvet heavy, hanging still. She had pushed through that curtain 10,000 times. She had carried trays through it and bread baskets through it, and the specific contained weight of everything she had heard behind it. She had been invisible behind it and useful behind it, and for 6 months she had been something much more specific and much more dangerous behind it, and now she was standing outside it in the cold with a cloth tray and a pencil and the feeling of a chapter closing that had been open so long she had stopped thinking of it as a chapter. Reeves was still on his radio, his voice urgent and quiet, the napkin in his hand. Harmon came out the back door 30 seconds later, took one look at his face and took the napkin from him without being told. She read it. She looked at Natalia. "You memorized cross-reference codes from a 12-page document you read for approximately 90 seconds while sitting in a room with 14 people and a live threat." "I have a good memory," Natalia said, clearly. Harmon looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression that Natalia was beginning to recognize as her default mode, always assessing, always measuring, always deciding what a person was worth in a specific context. How do you feel about a different kind of work? She said. Natalia looked at her. Long-term, Harmon said. Structured, paid this time, with actual legal protection. You're offering me a job, Natalia said. I'm offering you a conversation about a bomb, Harmon said. Tomorrow, after you've slept. She paused. If you're interested. Natalia looked back at the curtain in the window. She thought about Thursday nights. She thought about 11 years of bread rolls and espresso cups and a reservation book that read like a hit list. She thought about her father and about the photograph in a federal facility and about Volkov's voice on a recording that was already, she knew, being processed somewhere in a federal building 3 miles from here. She thought about a room full of men who had never once looked at her. Not really. She thought about what she could do in rooms like that if the rooms were different, if the rules were different, if she walked in with a badge instead of a tray. Yes, she said, I'm interested. Harmon nodded. She went back inside. Reeves looked at Natalia. You okay? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She had been asked it 3 times tonight and had given 3 different answers, and she was beginning to suspect that none of them had been fully accurate. Ask me tomorrow, she said. He nodded. He held the car door open. She got in. Behind her, through the closed car window, the restaurant continued its slow process of closing down. Lights in the main room beginning to dim one by one from front to back, the ordinary rhythm of an ending. The back room light was still on. It would stay on for a while, yet she knew. There was a great deal to be done in there. A great deal to be documented and collected and examined and understood. The car pulled away from the curb. She did not look back, but she kept her hand in her apron pocket, her fingers resting on the pencil stub, the small, ordinary tool of a woman who had spent 11 years writing down what people ordered and making sure she got it exactly right. 11 years of practice. She wasn't done yet. The FBI field office at 4 in the morning had a specific kind of energy that Natalia had not expected. She had imagined it quieter, more procedural, the kind of contained fluorescent stillness you associate with institutions at odd hours, the hum of machinery, the occasional footstep, the sense of a place holding itself in suspension until the workday resumed. Instead, it was loud, not chaotic, but dense phones, ringing voices moving between rooms, the purposeful back and forth of people processing a situation that was still actively developing. Volkov's arrest had apparently triggered a cascade that nobody in the building was sleeping through. She could feel it the moment she walked in, the particular electricity of a large operation breaking open years of groundwork, suddenly converting into action. Reeves took her to a room on the 4th floor. Small, clean 2 chairs and a table and a window that looked onto a hallway rather than the outside world. He brought her coffee, actual coffee, not the restaurant variety she'd been pouring for 11 years, just a paper cup from a machine in the hall, but hot and real, and he sat across from her and put a recorder on the table and said, "Whenever you're ready." She drank half the coffee first. He let her. Then she started talking. She talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes without stopping for anything more than water and the occasional clarifying question from Reeves or from Harmon, who came in and out of the room with the focused restlessness of someone managing 4 things simultaneously. Natalia laid it out in chronological order, not because anyone had told her to, but because that was how the information lived in her memory, indexed by date and by Thursday, and by the particular quality of tension in the room when something important was said. She told them about the shipping manifest discussed in the autumn of 3 years ago. She told them about the conversation between Moretti and a state senator that had taken place over the lamb chops in February 2 years back. She told them about the money, the names, the locations, the specific vocabulary that Moretti's people used when they were discussing something they needed to make untraceable. She told them about Lysenko when he had started appearing at the Thursday dinners, what he talked about, who he called from the back room on the nights when Moretti stepped away. She told them everything. Reeves wrote continuously. Harmon, when she was in the room, listened without expression, but Natalia caught her twice making a small mark in the margin of her own notes, the involuntary notation of someone hearing something that connected to something else they already knew. At the 2-hour mark, Harmon leaned forward. The codes you copied from Volkov's document, the witness protection cross-references. She opened her laptop, turned it toward Natalia. I need you to look at what we've pulled and tell me if any of these match what you wrote. Natalia looked at the screen. Lines of alphanumeric codes organized in columns. She had written 7 of them on the napkin from memory. She found 4 of them on the screen within 30 seconds. Those 4, she said, exactly as listed. Harmon looked at Reeves. Something passed between them that Natalia couldn't read fully, but the weight of it was visible. That confirms the source is internal, Harmon said. Not to Natalia, to herself, really. The specific vocal quality of a conclusion arriving. Someone with database access. How many people have access to those codes? Reeves asked. In this building, Harmon said. 14. She closed the laptop. She looked at Natalia. Don't repeat that number to anyone. I understand compartmentalization, Natalia said. I've been practicing it for 11 years. Harmon almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to it all night. Yes, she said. You have. She took her laptop, moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. The offer I made outside the restaurant, I meant it, but I need you to understand what it would actually involve before you give me a real answer. Tell me, Natalia said. Harmon sat back down. What she described was not what Natalia had imagined when she heard the word badge. It wasn't a desk. It wasn't even primarily fieldwork in the conventional sense. What Harmon was describing was something more specific and considerably more unusual, a role built around exactly the skill set Natalia had spent 11 years developing without knowing she was developing it. Presence in controlled environments, linguistic access, the particular intelligence gathering capability of someone who could be in a room and not register as a threat, not because she was performing invisibility, but because she had so thoroughly mastered the art of being underestimated that it had become a genuine and deployable asset. There are rooms, Harmon said, that we can't put a badge into, rooms where everyone knows everyone, where a new face requires 3 years of backstory and 2 personal vouchers to be accepted. Rooms where the information we need is spoken aloud every week in front of service staff, because the people in those rooms have never once considered the possibility that the person pouring their water is someone worth accounting for. Natalia was very still. You want to put me in other restaurants? Not just restaurants, Harmon said, but yes, that's the center of it. For how long? Assignments vary. Some are weeks, some are longer. She paused. You'd have full federal protection, a handled identity for each operation, legal immunity for anything incidental to your work. Another pause. And you would never again be on a list like the one Volkov put on the table tonight without us knowing about it first. Natalia thought about the list, her name at the bottom of it in a document that had been carried into a room she'd been standing in for 2 hours before she saw it. The specific sick hold of reading your own name in that context, not a surprise exactly, because she had known the risks going in, had calculated them as best she could, and decided the calculation was worth it. But knowing the risk and seeing it printed on a page in front of you were 2 different experiences, and the distance between them was larger than she'd anticipated. I'll need to think about it, she said. Take the time you need, Harmon said. She stood again. But not too much time. The situation is moving quickly. She was at the door. Get some sleep first. She left. Reeves made a note. Natalia finished her coffee. Then Reeves looked up from his notepad and said, There's something we haven't talked about yet. She looked at him. There are approximately 40 things we haven't talked about yet. Moretti, he said. She waited. He gave us the paper, the names and locations of Lysenko's external contacts. Reeves set his pen down. That's significant cooperation. It's the kind of thing that affects how the prosecution moves forward. He looked at her directly. His attorney is already in the building. How long has he been here? He arrived 12 minutes after we did, Reeves said. Moretti apparently had a standing arrangement. If he ever didn't call by midnight on a Thursday, the attorney came in. 11 years of preparation, she thought. He really had been waiting for his particular Thursday. What does he want? She said. We don't know yet. His attorney isn't talking details until morning. Reeves picked up his pen again. But Moretti asked specifically to speak with you before the formal process starts. She looked at the table. That's not standard. No, Reeves agreed. It's not. Is it sanctioned? It will be if you agree to it, he said. Short supervised, recorded, his attorney present, Harmon present. He paused. You don't have to. She thought about what Moretti had said at the table. You were the best person in this room. She thought about the paper he'd slid across the wet tablecloth, the names written in his own hand, the decision behind it that had happened faster than she would have predicted from a man who had built 12 years of power on never moving without calculation. Okay, she said, but I have a condition. Reeves raised his eyebrows. I want to know before I walk into that room exactly what federal protection means for him, what cooperation buys him, what the actual numbers look like. She looked at Reeves steadily, because he's going to ask me if it was worth it, and I want to be able to answer him honestly. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. He got up and left the room. She sat alone for the first time since the car ride over, and she let the silence be what it was. The sound of everything having already happened, the specific quiet of a situation that has moved past its crisis point and is now in the long, unglamorous process of becoming consequence. She was tired, the kind of tired that lives in the bones rather than just the body, the tiredness of sustained vigilance, finally releasing the fatigue of being absolutely present and alert for hours beyond the point where normal human alertness sustains itself. She had been running on something since 8 o'clock that evening, and whatever it was almost gone now. And what was underneath it was not weakness exactly, but something more honest than strength. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them. The same hands that had carried trays for 11 years. The same hands that had poured water for Adrienne Moretti's Thursday meetings since the second week of her employment. The same hands that had pressed record on a phone, written codes on a napkin, slid a photograph across a table, made 11 years of silence into something that had finally tonight broken through the surface. The door opened. It was not Reeves. It was a man she had never seen, late 50s, rumpled suit, the professional exhaustion of someone who had been woken up and driven across the city in the middle of the night and was managing it by pretending it was a normal circumstance. He had a leather briefcase and the kind of face that had spent decades being strategically unreadable. Ms. Petro, he said, I'm Arthur Breen. I represent Mr. Moretti. She looked at him. I know who you are, she said. I've heard your name in that room more times than you'd probably want to know about. He paused, then he sat down across from her. He set his briefcase on the table but didn't open it. I'll be direct, he said. Mr. Moretti wants to speak with you. Not to negotiate, his negotiation is with the federal government and will proceed on its own track. He wants to speak with you personally. He looked at her carefully. He understands if you refuse. I already told Agent Reeves I'd do it, she said. Breen blinked. He didn't mention that. He went to get information from me first, she said. We're waiting. Breen looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. She recognized it. She had been seeing it on men's faces all night. Reeves came back 8 minutes later with a single sheet of paper, which he placed in front of her without comment. She read it. It was a preliminary cooperation framework, not final, not signed, but reflecting the current federal position on what Moretti's level of cooperation could reasonably produce. Significant reduction on certain counts. Consideration on others. The specific language was careful and non-committal, in the way that legal language always is, but underneath the careful language, the shape of it was legible. He would not die in prison. That was the shape of it. She folded the paper and handed it back to Reeves. Okay, she said, take me to him. They put her in a room 3 doors down. Moretti was at the table, jacket off, tie loosened, the first time she had ever seen him anything less than completely assembled. His attorney sat to his right. Harmon stood near the door, a recorder on the table, red light on. Moretti looked up when she came in. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything, and in his face she saw the thing that 11 years of Thursday nights had never once shown her: the person underneath the architecture. The man who had existed before the power and the protocol and the careful management of every room he entered. He looked tired, genuinely humanly tired. Sit down, he said. She sat. I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself, he said. I understand what you did and why. I'm not sure I'd have done it differently. He paused. Actually, I would have. I'd have done it worse, with less patience. She said nothing. Lizenko, he said, I want you to know, not for the record, not for any legal purpose, just for you, that if I had known what he did to your father, he would not have been in my organization. I don't operate that way. She looked at him. How do you operate? Not cleanly, he said. I know that. I've never argued otherwise. He looked at his hands. But there are things I've never sanctioned, things I've never allowed in my organization regardless of the value. Killing civilians, killing family. He paused. Your father was both. She absorbed this. She did not know how much of it to believe, and she understood that she would probably never know with complete certainty. But she had spent 11 years learning to read the quality of statements made in that back room, and what she heard in his voice right now was not performance. The paper you gave us, she said, Lysenko's external contacts. How current is that information as of tonight, he said. I had someone verify the locations 3 hours before the dinner. I've known for 6 weeks that something was coming. I didn't know it was going to be Volkov, didn't know it was going to be tonight, but I knew the window was closing. He looked at her. I've been preparing exits for a long time. The cooperation, she said, it's real. You'll follow through. I've never made a commitment I didn't keep, he said. That's not modesty. That's the only reason I lasted 12 years. He straightened slightly in his chair. What I give them will be complete and accurate. Timelines, names, financial structures, the works. He paused. It'll be the most useful thing I've ever done for this city. That's a strange thought. Breen shifted beside him. Moretti glanced at his attorney and Breen went still. There's something I need to tell you, Moretti said to Natalia. Something that isn't on any of the documents Volkov brought tonight. Harmon near the door straightened slightly. Lysenko has a secondary operation, Moretti said, separate from mine running parallel for the last 2 years. I didn't know the full scope of it until 4 months ago. By the time I understood what it was too large for me to dismantle from the inside without exposing myself. He looked at Natalia directly. It involves the witness protection leak. Volkov was using it, yes, but Volkov wasn't the source of it. The room was absolutely still. Reeves said very carefully, What are you saying? Lysenko built a second income stream, selling protected witness identities to multiple buyers, Moretti said. Volkov was one. There are at least 2 others. The leak isn't a single pipeline, it's a distribution system. He paused. And the source inside the federal program isn't in this building. Harmon moved from the door to the table in 3 steps. Where U.S. Marshal Service, Moretti said. An administrator in the Chicago field office. I have the name, the bank account that received the payments in the transfer records going back 18 months. He looked at Natalia one more time. Your codes on the napkin, the ones that didn't match what they pulled from this building's database. That's why. They're routed through Chicago. Natalia thought about the 4 codes that had matched and the 3 that hadn't. She had noticed the 3 non-matching ones and filed them without knowing what they meant. Now they meant something very specific and very serious. Reeves was already on his radio. Harmon had her phone out. The room had changed temperature in the space of 30 seconds. Moretti looked at the activity he'd set in motion, and what was in his face was something she hadn't seen from him all night and hadn't expected to see, a kind of relief that was almost indistinguishable from exhaustion. The relief of a man setting down something very heavy that he has been carrying for a long time in a direction he no longer believed in. 12 years, he said mostly to himself. You built something for 12 years, and then you sit in a room in the middle of the night and take it apart piece by piece. He looked at her. Does it get easier? She thought about her father, about 17 years of carrying a name and a face and a specific sustaining anger that had kept her moving through 11 years of Thursday nights. About the photograph she'd seen on Reeves's phone, the ordinary face in the booking camera's light. I don't know yet, she said. Tonight is the first night of it for me too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the restaurant will close. Without the Thursday nights, Gerald won't be able to make the lease. He almost smiled. Tell him I said sorry. She thought of Gerald sweating through his collar every Thursday for 11 years. I will, she said. Breen touched Moretti's arm. We should let the agents work, he said. Moretti nodded. He looked at Natalia one last time. He did not say anything else. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said between them had been said in one form or another over the course of a single Thursday night that had turned out to be the last Thursday night, and the particular silence that existed between them now was not unfriendly. She stood. She walked to the door. Reeves was already coordinating with someone in Chicago, his voice low and rapid. Harmon was 3 steps ahead, moving toward something that had just become urgent in a new way. Natalia stopped in the doorway. She looked back at Moretti. He was looking at the table, both hands flat, the same posture she had seen him in at 8 o'clock before the Russians arrived, when he was waiting for something he couldn't see coming. But the thing he'd been waiting for had already arrived, had been in the room with him the whole time, had been pouring his water. She turned and walked out into the hallway, and the door closed behind her, and in front of her, the 4th floor of the FBI field office was in full motion. Voices, phones, the urgent machinery of a situation cascading outward from a single point of origin. Her name on a list, her hand on a phone, a recording, a napkin, a pencil stub, 11 years of practice. She walked toward the activity. She walked toward Harmon, who looked up when she approached and said without preamble, "We're coordinating with the Marshal Service Inspector General. Chicago field office is being locked down." She paused. "The 3 codes you wrote that didn't match our database, we need you to write them again from memory right now." Natalia took the pen Harmon was holding out. She took a clean sheet of paper. She wrote 3 codes from memory clearly and without hesitation, because she had read them once and she did not forget things she had read. Harmon took the paper. She looked at it. She looked at Natalia. "You read that document for 90 seconds. 80 maybe?" Natalia said. Harmon was quiet for a moment. Then she said again, with the same measured tone as outside the restaurant, "How do you feel about a different kind of work?" This time, Natalia didn't say she needed to think about it. "What's the first assignment?" she said. Harmon almost smiled again. This time it completed itself. "Get some sleep," she said. "We'll talk in the morning." She turned back to her phone. Natalia stood in the middle of the hallway, people moving around her on both sides. The building alive with the consequence of a single Thursday night in a restaurant where nobody had noticed the waitress. Her apron was still on. She reached around and untied it. She folded it once, then again, and held it in her hands for a moment. Then she set it on the nearest desk. She didn't need it anymore. She slept for 4 hours on a cot in a room on the 2nd floor that someone had pointed her toward without ceremony, and when she woke up, the building was in full daylight operation, and someone had left a fresh cup of coffee on the floor beside her and a clean shirt still in its packaging on the chair. She sat up. She put her feet on the floor. She held the coffee in both hands, and she sat in the specific quiet of a person who has crossed from one version of their life into another and is sitting for just this moment in the space between them. Then she put on the shirt, drank the coffee, and went to find Harmon. Harmon was on the 3rd floor in a glass-walled conference room surrounded by 4 other agents, 2 laptops, a whiteboard covered in names and connecting lines, and a phone on speaker that was currently broadcasting a conversation from Chicago that sounded controlled and urgent in equal measure. She saw Natalia through the glass and held up one finger 1 minute without breaking her attention from the room. Natalia waited in the hallway. She looked at the whiteboard through the glass. She could read most of what was written on it from where she stood, and what she read told her that the night had continued developing in her absence. The Chicago administrator Moretti had named was a man called Raymond Farrell, 22 years with the U.S. Marshal Service, a record that apparently contained nothing more alarming than a parking citation in 2019 and what someone had written beside his name in red marker as clean on paper flagged on 3 internal audits nobody followed up on. The bank account Moretti had referenced had been traced overnight. The transfers were real. The timeline went back further than 18 months. It went back 4 years, which meant the exposure was considerably wider than even Moretti had known. Reeves appeared beside her. He had the slightly compressed look of a man who had not slept at all and had made peace with that. "Farrell is in custody as of 40 minutes ago," he said. "Chicago moved fast once the request came through." He looked at the whiteboard. "The 2 additional buyers Moretti mentioned, we've identified one of them. International. Harmon is coordinating with Interpol." He paused. "It's a large morning." "Because of a napkin," Natalia said. "Because of a napkin," he confirmed. Through the glass, Harmon wrapped up the phone call. She said something to the agents around her, and 3 of them immediately stood and left the room with the decisive movement of people who have just received their assignments. She came out into the hallway and looked at Natalia with the evaluating expression that Natalia was starting to think of as her natural resting face. "How do you feel?" Harriman said. "Ready," Natalia said. Harmon nodded once. Then let's talk about what comes next. She took her into a smaller room, just the two of them, this time no recorder on the table, which Natalia noticed and which Harmon acknowledged. This part is a conversation, Harmon said, not a deposition. What Harmon laid out over the next 40 minutes was specific enough that Natalia understood it wasn't an improvised offer. This had existed before last night. A framework, a structure, a defined role that had been waiting for the right person to fill it, and the right person had turned out to be someone who had been building exactly the right skill set in a restaurant kitchen for 11 years without anyone having the wit to ask her. There were 4 active operations, Harmon said, where the kind of access Natalia had demonstrated at Cello Nero would be directly applicable. 2 domestic, 2 international. Each one involving environments where conventional federal presence was impossible, rooms that required exactly what she had: fluency, patience, and the specific cultivated ability to be in a space without becoming part of people's awareness of it. The international ones, Natalia said. Which languages? Harmon looked at her. Russian is primary, but we'd need to assess what else you have. Ukrainian, Natalia said. Polish conversationally, German enough to follow a fast conversation if I know the subject matter. She paused. I've been listening to people speak for 11 years. You absorb things. Harmon made a note. We'd put you through a formal assessment process, 3 weeks, probably 4. Linguistic, psychological, situational response evaluation. What does the psychological component look at? Stress response under observation, Harmon said. Compartmentalization capacity, the ability to maintain a constructed identity under sustained pressure without fragmentation. She looked up from her notes. Based on last night, I'm not particularly worried about any of those. Last night I was myself, Natalia said. A constructed identity is different. Yes, Harmon said. It is, and that's an honest and important distinction. She set her pen down, which is why the assessment exists, not to screen people out, to make sure the support structure is right for the person going in. Because the work is real, the risk is real, and we don't put people in rooms like that without understanding exactly what they need to come back out intact. Natalia thought about that. She thought about what intact meant and whether she had been intact for the past 6 months, and whether the specific kind of functioning she had been doing, carrying weight without anyone to share it with, making decisions without anyone to verify them against spending every Thursday in a room full of dangerous people, and then going home to an apartment in Astoria and making tea and watching the news and going to sleep, whether that constituted intact or whether it was a different thing entirely that had just been working well enough to look like it from the outside. I want to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. The people who do this work, the long-term operations, the sustained cover identities, what do they do with the things they can't tell anyone? She looked at Harmon directly. Not classified information. I understand the protocols for that. I mean the other things, the personal weight of it, the things that accumulate. Harmon was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, actually considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. There are people to talk to, she said finally. Structured support. And there are people who have done this work who you'd be connected to over time, who understand it from the inside. She paused. It's not a perfect system. The work is hard. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. She met Natalia's eyes. But it's not what you've been doing for 6 months. You won't be alone in it. Natalia absorbed this. Then she said, okay, tell me about the assessment process. Harmon almost smiled for the 3rd time. This one completed itself fully, briefly, and then was gone, but it had been real. 3 weeks from now, she said, we'll start with a briefing, get you set up with housing. In the meantime, salary starts from today. She picked her pen back up. One more thing. What? Lysenko's arraignment is in 6 days, she said. The prosecution is going to want your testimony about what you heard in that room over the past 6 months. Specific conversations, dates, context. She looked at Natalia carefully. It'll be the first time you're visible in a public proceeding, your name on the court record. Natalia thought about that. 11 years of invisibility as a survival strategy. The thing she had maintained not out of preference but out of necessity. The understanding that being seen was being vulnerable. that being known was being targetable, that the safest position in a room full of power was always the one nobody thought to account for. I know, she said. I'll testify. It'll change things, Harmon said. Once your name is on that record, the protective obscurity you've had is gone. Anyone looking for you will be able to find the thread. Anyone looking for me already found the thread, Natalia said. Volkov put my name on a list. My obscurity was already gone. Last night just made it official. She looked at Harmon steadily. I'd rather be visible on my own terms than invisible on someone else's. Harmon looked at her for a moment. That's a good way to think about it, she said quietly. She left to coordinate with the prosecution team. Natalia sat alone in the small room for a few minutes, and then she got up and walked to the window, a real one, this time looking out onto the street. The ordinary Friday morning activity of a city that had no particular awareness of what had happened inside this building overnight. Cars, people, a food cart on the corner, sending steam into the cold air. She watched it for a while. Then Reeves knocked on the door and came in. He had the look of a man who had finally, somewhere in the past hour, transitioned from running on adrenaline to running on caffeine, and the transition had not been entirely smooth. There's someone here, he said. Someone asking to speak to you. He paused. It's not official. We don't have to accommodate it. She turned from the window. Hoot Carlo Reyes, he said. Moretti's underboss. She was quiet for a moment. He's in custody. He was processed this morning. He's got his own attorney, his own process underway. But he asked specifically, he said he had information that was for you, not for us. Reeves looked uncomfortable. Which is irregular. Did you explain that to him? His attorney explained that anything he said in your presence would be recorded and admissible. And he still wants to come? Still wants to come. She thought about Carlo, the man who had pushed the table hard enough to send water glasses to the floor. The man who had looked at her across the back room with the grief of someone who had misjudged the source of the threat. The man who had been loyal to Moretti for what she calculated from 11 years of Thursday evenings was somewhere close to 15 years. Bring him in, she said. Carlo looked smaller away from the restaurant. Not physically, he was still a large man, but the environment of Cello Nero's back room had given him a specific authority that the fluorescent reality of a federal building hallway stripped away. He came in with his attorney, sat down across from her, and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. You were there every Thursday, he said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like someone saying a thing out loud to confirm it was real. Yes, she said. I used to wave you over, he said, for the water, for the bread. He shook his head. You never looked like anything except what you were. I know, she said. That's a talent, he said. Not bitterly, with something closer to genuine respect, which was not what she'd expected and which landed unexpectedly hard. What did you want to tell me? She said. He leaned forward, forearms on the table. His attorney put a hand on his arm. He looked at the attorney, and the attorney, reading something in his expression, moved the hand away. Lysenko, Carlo said. He has a daughter, 23 years old, living in Newark. She doesn't know anything about his business. Nothing. She thinks her father works in international finance. He paused. She's going to find out today what he actually is. She's going to find out today that his life's work is responsible for the deaths of people in witness protection who trusted the government to keep them safe. He looked at Natalia steadily. She's going to be alone in that. Natalia looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because you know what that's like, he said. Finding out what your father really was, living with what it means. He was quiet for a moment. I thought someone should know she exists. Someone who might actually understand it from the inside. He paused. Someone who isn't a prosecutor. She sat with this for a long moment. She thought about being 17 years old and standing on a fire escape in the cold, listening to men plan her father's death. She thought about the years after the specific unshared weight of knowing something that changed everything and having nowhere to put it. She thought about what it had cost her to carry it alone and what it would have been worth at 23 to have someone sit across from her who understood what that weight actually felt like. What's her name? She said. Carlo told her. She memorized it the way she memorized everything, completely instantly, filed precisely alongside everything else she had absorbed in 11 years of standing in rooms and paying attention. I'm not making any promises, she said. I'm not asking for promises, Carlo said. Just that someone knows. He stood. His attorney guided him toward the door. He stopped before he reached it and looked back at her. For what it's worth, he said, every one of us in that room last night made our choices. We knew what we were walking into every Thursday. We just forgot that other people make choices, too. He looked at her with something she recognized as the particular clarity of a man who has stopped performing and is speaking plain. You were always the smartest person in that room. We just didn't have the sense to look. He left. Natalia sat in the quiet for a while. Then she took out the small notepad that Reeves had given her during the debrief regulation FBI issue. Used spiral-bound, the kind that fit in a jacket pocket, and she wrote down the name Carlo had given her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the notepad in her pocket. The morning moved forward in the particular way of large institutional processes, pieces assembling people, moving decisions, converting into procedures. She was in and out of 3 more rooms over the next 2 hours. She signed documents. She gave a recorded statement to a prosecutor named Walsh, who had the intense focus of someone who had been waiting for this deposition for a long time and could not quite believe he was getting it. She ate something, a sandwich from the building's cafeteria that she consumed standing in a hallway between a conversation with Harmon and a phone call that Reeves needed her on because the Interpol contact was Russian-speaking and the translator they'd arranged had missed his connection from D.C. She took the phone. She translated for 11 minutes. When she handed the phone back to Reeves, he looked at her with the same expression he'd had outside the restaurant, and she understood it was becoming his default expression around her, which was fine. At 2 in the afternoon, Harmon found her in the hallway outside Walsh's office and said, "There's something happening with Volkov." She followed Harmon to the 4th floor. The conference room was back to full operation, phones agents, the whiteboard updated with new lines and new names. At the center of the new information was a development that had apparently emerged in the past 90 minutes. Volkov in his holding cell had requested a meeting with federal prosecutors. Not his attorney's idea, his. He wants to deal, Harmon said, which is not a surprise. What is a surprise is the specific thing he's offering. She turned to look at Harmon. What is it? He says the witness protection leak isn't the top of the structure, Harmon said. He says Farrell in Chicago was being directed, that there's a level above Farrell that we haven't identified. She paused. He says he'll give us the name and full documentation in exchange for specific terms. Do you believe him? Natalia said. I believe he has something, Harmon said. Whether it's as significant as he's representing it, that's the question. She looked at Natalia carefully. He also made a specific request as part of the negotiation. She already knew what it was before Harmon said it. He wants you in the room, Harmon said, as translator. His words, he'll conduct the negotiation in Russian only, and he'll only accept the translation of the woman from the restaurant. The room was quiet for a moment. Reeves across the table said, "We can refuse it. It's an irregular request, and there's no obligation." "I'll do it," Natalia said. Natalia. "He trusts that I'll translate accurately," she said. "He told me that at the restaurant he wanted me there because neither side fully trusted me, which he believed made me honest. He still believes that." She looked at Harmon. "He's right that I'll translate accurately. That works in our favor, not his. If he says something incriminating, thinking it's only going to his own counsel, I'm going to translate it." Harmon looked at her for a long moment. "You understand this puts you in a room with him again." "I've been in rooms with men like him for 11 years, she said. "The difference now is that this time I'm not pretending I don't understand what they're saying." 20 minutes later, she was in a room on the 2nd floor. Volkov was already there, no jacket. This time shirt sleeves, the silver hair slightly less composed than it had been at Cello Nero, but the eyes exactly the same, recording everything, assessing. His attorney was present. Walsh was present. Harmon stood at the wall. Reeves was beside Natalia. Volkov looked at her as she sat down. "You came," he said, in Russian. "You asked," she said, in English. He smiled, the smile from the restaurant patient calculating. But something in it was different now. The leverage was gone, and without the leverage, what remained in the smile was something more complicated and considerably more honest. "I want to speak to you directly," he said. still in Russian. She translated it for the room. Walsh said, "Mr. Volkov, all communication needs to—" "Let him speak," Natalia said. She looked at Volkov. "Whatever you say, I translate completely. You understand that?" "I'm counting on it," he said. He reached into the folder in front of him and produced a single document. He slid it toward her, not toward Walsh, not toward Harmon, toward her. "The name above Farrell's dito," he said in Russian. "It's in the second paragraph. I want you to read it first." She looked at the document. She read the second paragraph. She read it twice. Then she put the document flat on the table and looked at Harmon. "You need to see this," she said. Harmon crossed to the table. She read the paragraph. The color shifted in her face in a way that was barely visible but unmistakable. She looked up. She looked at Reeves. She said very quietly, "Get the director on the phone." Volkov watched this happen with the focused attention of a man watching a complicated machine do exactly what he built it to do. He looked at Natalia. "I told you last night that you were someone I hadn't calculated for," he said in Russian. She translated it. "I was wrong," he said. "I had calculated for someone like you. I just hadn't expected them to already be in the room." He folded his hands on the table. "The name in that document, getting it into the right hands, required someone with your particular position. Inside enough to be trusted. Outside enough to be credible." He paused. "The FBI would never have taken it from me directly. But from the woman from the restaurant," he tilted his head. She stopped translating. "You used me," she said. "Not a question. I used the situation," he said. "You were part of the situation." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. She thought about the photograph he'd put on the table, the list with her name on it, the recording she'd made, everything she'd believed she was driving, and the possibility, the actual, real, uncomfortable possibility, that some portion of it had been moving in a direction someone else had also intended. "The list," she said, "my name on it." He looked at her directly. "Necessary," he said, "to make the threat real enough that you'd move, that Moretti would be forced to respond, that the entire room would destabilize at exactly the right moment." He paused. "I would not have acted on it." "I don't believe you," she said. "No," he said, "I know." He looked at the document on the table. "But the name in that paragraph is real. The documentation is real. Whatever I used to get it here, the thing itself is real, and it is the most significant piece of intelligence about the compromise of the federal witness program that currently exists." He looked at Harmon, then back at Natalia. "That's worth something, regardless of how it arrived." She sat with this for a long moment. The specific discomfort of realizing that a situation you believed you were navigating had more architects than you knew. That the line between using and being used was not always as clear as the side you believed you were standing on. But then she thought about Reeves's face when she'd hit play on the recording. She thought about Harmon reading the napkin. She thought about Moretti sliding a piece of paper across a wet tablecloth with Lysenko's contacts written in his own hand. She thought about the 4 codes that matched and the 3 that didn't, and Raymond Farrell in custody in Chicago, and Lysenko's photograph in the booking camera's light. Whatever Volkov had intended, she had made her own choices at every point. She had decided to record. She had decided to sit down at the table. She had decided to speak. She had written on the napkin herself with a pencil she had been carrying for 11 years because she had always written things down. Nobody had done that for her. "Translate the rest of it," Walsh said to her across the table. She looked at Volkov one last time. "One thing," she said to him in Russian. He waited. "My father's name was Dmitry Petrov," she said. "He was 41 years old. He drove a blue Peugeot, and he liked chess, and he made terrible coffee, and he was not a good man, but he was my father." She held Volkov's eyes. "I want you to remember that name. In whatever comes next for you, I want that name to be in the room." Volkov looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in those recording eyes that she had not seen in them before and could not fully name. "Dmitry Petrov," he said quietly. "I'll remember." She nodded. She turned to Walsh. She began to translate. The negotiation lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was complex, layered, and in several moments it came close to collapsing before Volkov, with the patience of a man who had decided on an outcome and was going to reach it, brought it back from the edge. The name in the document turned out to be exactly as significant as Volkov had represented a senior official whose access had enabled the systemic compromise of the witness protection program across 6 field offices over 5 years. Walsh left the room twice to make calls. Harmon left once and came back looking like a woman who had just watched a very long calculation finally produce its answer. By the time it was finished, the afternoon had gone and the building was in its early evening rhythm. Natalia sat in a chair at the side of the room and felt the accumulated weight of a night and a day of sustained, absolute attention, finally settling into her fully. She was not hollow. She was too full for that, too dense with everything she had processed and held and decided. But she was done. She was genuinely, completely done for this particular day. Reeves sat beside Baum as Walsh and Harmon moved into a side conversation near the door. "You okay?" he said. She looked at him. Then she actually considered the question with the full seriousness it had earned after being asked 4 times in 18 hours. "Yes," she said. "I think actually yes." He nodded. "Good." They sat quietly for a moment. "Volkov used me," she said. "Parts of tonight were moving the way he wanted them to move." Martin Reeves said, "Not all." "No," she said, "not all." "The recording was yours," he said. "The napkin was yours. The codes were yours. Moretti's cooperation, the paper he gave us, that happened because of how you handled that room. No one scripted that." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud." "Fair enough," he said. Harmon crossed back to them. She stopped in front of Natalia. She looked at her with the evaluating expression, and that something in it shifted the assessment completing itself. The conclusion reached the measurement done. "The assessment process I mentioned," she said, 3 weeks from now." "I know," Natalia said. "I said I was interested." "I want to be clear about what I'm actually offering," Harmon said. "Not a desk job with occasional field work. Not a support role. A principal position in active operations. You would be the primary intelligence-gathering asset in environments we cannot otherwise penetrate." She paused. "You would have authority over your own operational decisions. Within protocol, but with real discretion. Real agency." She looked at Natalia directly. Not invisible, not behind the scenes. Present, acknowledged, and protected. Natalia looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket. She took out the small notepad spiral-bound regulation issue, the kind that fit in a jacket pocket, and she took out the pencil stub from her apron, the one she had carried for 11 years, the one she had used on the napkin, the one that had been in her hand every Thursday night when she moved through that back room, writing down what people wanted. She looked at the pencil for a moment. She put it on the table. She kept the notepad. "Tell me about the first operation," she said. Harmon sat down, and she began to talk. And Natalia listened the way she had always listened, completely precisely missing nothing. 11 years behind a tray had taught her everything she needed to know about being in a room, about reading what people said and what they didn't say, and the space between those things where the truth actually lived, about staying when everything in you wanted to run, and speaking when everything in you had been trained to stay silent, and choosing deliberately on your own terms, in your own time, when to be seen. She had been invisible because she had needed to be. She had been patient because the work required it. She had spent 11 years building a skill that no one had asked her to build, in a room that no one thought to secure, listening to things that no one imagined she could hear. She was done being the woman no one saw. From now on, she would decide exactly who saw her and when, and what they understood about what they were looking at. That was not invisibility. That was power. And Natalia Petrov, daughter of Dmitry Petrov, 11-year waitress at Cello Nero, the woman who had walked into a room full of dangerous men and made herself the most important person in it. She had been building toward that power since the night she stood on a fire escape at 17 years old and listened and understood and did not look away. She was just getting started.